Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation on the preservation of photographic negatives. Before we begin with the preservation discussion, I should probably explain exactly what a photographic negative is. Photographic negatives are, in the simplest term, a form of film utilized for photography. The material is made from an image-producing source or emulsion which is placed onto a base. The primary bases that are used for these negatives initially were glass, but this eventually changed to nitrate or cellulose acetate film, cellulose acetate being the most common in the current day. Preservation and care of these objects, it should also be noted, relates very heavily to how photographs are preserved. Much of the care and preservation for these objects are more heavily entwined than one would think. The best way to handle a negative can be seen in the photograph. There are many specific instructions for handling, not just for storage and preservation. It is best to handle the materials with gloved hands and to only touch the edge of the negative as seen in the photograph. Handling the photographic portion of a negative can result in the image being damaged, with or without gloves. But before storing and while handling, it would also be wise to ensure that the negatives are free from any sort of dust. Dust can cause a good deal of damage, especially for plate glass negatives. Removing dust will prevent the damage that can be caused by it, or preventing the negatives from being damaged in storage, no less. Now, the major risk for deterioration can be several problems in the manufacturing process: storage, poor storage especially, poor handling, or processing. As will be mentioned somewhat shortly, if the film is of color stock, color degradation is a very big risk. The best proper storage condition for a photographic negative is very similar to those needed for regular photographs. It would be best to store negatives with acid-free paper, alongside dry, cooler temperatures and minimal light. It would also be wise to store these negatives flat. Storing negatives in any other format will result in, well, further damage. Now, the biggest inherent vice, and this is a very big problem with especially cellulose acetate film, vinegar deterioration, once it begins, results in the negative becoming unsalvageable. And as you can see in the image that is present on this slide, vinegar deterioration results in the image becoming warped, cracked, and thoroughly damaged. It can only be delayed. It cannot be stopped once the deterioration has begun. This can be detected by a smell of vinegar emerging from the negative, at which point it's almost impossible to save the negative. There is, unfortunately, also a unique issue with color negatives. It will ultimately deteriorate over time, the color, resulting in the image appearing saturated with the color that is deteriorating, funnily enough. Say if you're utilizing a color image with yellow, blue, and red dye applied to the photograph, once it deteriorates, the yellow portion will fade first, then the blue, then the red. Now, in terms of slowing down the damage with vinegar deterioration, it will be wise to actually store the negatives in cold storage and low humidity. However, this must be used carefully or the damage could end up worsening because of it. Color deterioration, sadly, is not affected by this. This means that the best form of preservation of photographic negatives is primarily to delay the inevitable damage, but also to digitally preserve the negatives. Now, for a physical negative, it would be best to store them in an acid-free box or folder and as a form of preservation. There are also specialized boxes existing for negative storage, but acid-free boxes will work regardless of specialization. When it comes to negatives, though, it would also be wise to scan them as soon as possible, essentially digitizing the photograph. Especially this is due to the damage or poor condition, or if the negative is nearing full deterioration. This digital process will preserve the negative once the physical copy will ultimately disappear, regardless of damage. Color restoration, as you can see in this photograph, is possible, and my apologies for the quality of the image. You can restore the image via digital tools. It is difficult, but it allows the negative and the photograph to resemble what it would have appeared as before the deterioration began, although this has its own set of issues. Now, I have two scenarios here for you to consider. The first scenario revolves around the proper storage for photographic negatives, namely the cost for installing and the running of a cold storage program in an archive. Be wise to think about the logistics here, the type of systems that will be offered, and the considerable amount of difficulties there would be for the installment of a cold storage for the negatives. The damage that the negatives have undergone, the system that would need to be installed, as well as trying to prevent further damage therein. The second scenario is somewhat, I would think, a bit easier to understand. This focuses more on scanning and color deterioration. Seeing that it results in colors fading, and it is possible to restore the colors with a digital file, I want you to think about the problems that restoring this image would face, especially in terms of provenance and conservation. Is this the original image being restored? What should we do with the physical copy? Those sort of things there. And here are the sources here. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I look forward to the discussion.